We know that globally, around 84% of people subscribe to a faith, which means that faith leaders, faith actors, faith communities, faith-based organizations have a very powerful and uniquely impactful role to play in catalyzing the change in thought that leads to the change in behavior, which is needed so critically in order for us to achieve the SDGs. Today, we have the great honor of coming together with governments, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society, including, of course, the world of faith, to honestly and critically examine where we stand and how we can improve in our work for SDG 5, gender equality and empowerment. Our eminent speakers will share their experiences, successes, challenges, and suggestions for working both with and as religious actors and religious leaders to bring about a world of true equality, where everyone's human rights are honored and fulfilled. We give great gratitude to the co-organizers of this event, who are the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Denmark, Canada Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development Germany, BMZ, Side by Side, Islamic Relief Worldwide, ACT Alliance, Lutheran World Federation, CAICID, the Global Interfaith WASH Alliance, Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, USPG, and the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. So deep gratitude to all of the co-organizers, as well as all of the eminent speakers you're about to hear from. And it's a great honor to begin with the opening remarks by Ambassador Michael Seward, the Special Representative for Freedom of Religion and Belief, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before Ambassador Michael Seward took office in September 2018, he served as Ambassador of Denmark to Portugal since 2014, where he was also accredited to Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and Sao Tome and Principe. As head of the department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was responsible for European policy and treaties during the Danish EU presidency, as well as the Danish political, economic, and foreign assistance relations toward Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It's a great honor to ask our Ambassador Michael Seward to give the opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Sadvi. I'm really pleased that more than 300 have chosen to join us today for this webinar on gender, religion, and public decision-making. I'm very grateful to PART for taking the lead in organizing a side event on this topic. Seen from my perspective, the challenge for us is how to unlock the mutually beneficial potentials of religion and folk and gender equality, but also to avoid all pitfalls. Faith-based actors have an enormous possibility to do just that. However, we must recognize that gender and religion are still not happily engaged totally. Too much animosity and skepticism still exist. The Danish government has made it one of our main priorities to try to help to overcome this divide by promoting cross-fertilization of the two sides. However, some gender activists still regard us folk ambassadors as the protectors of the so-called dark side or the patriarchal religious forces. I understand that. Change takes time. After decades of misuse by some religious organizations and actors to suppress women's rights, it's understandable that folk is perceived as the right of religions that protect old habits and traditions decided by men and favoring men. It has been misused to hinder and undermine gender equality. It's been misused to justify religiously based laws, policies, and practices that discriminate on the ground of gender. Areas of particular concern include personal status and family laws, laws that regulate sexual relations, discrimination and violence against women and religious minorities, restrictions on access to health, gender-based violence and harmful practices, and gender-based discrimination within religious institutions. However, we need to change this antagonistic mislabeling of gender versus religion and phobe. We need to do away with the interpretation that phobe is the right of religions. It is foremost the right of the individual. And it's in this recognition that this human right has the liberating potential to promote gender equality. Therefore, we must forge strategic partnership between those of us working for promoting each individual human right and with those of you who want to promote gender equality. That is not about selling your soul to the dark side or the devil. This is about acknowledging that the vast majority of people, as you said, on the planet are believers, and they have a right to be so. In fact, phobe and religion can be a resource in ensuring equality and non-discrimination for all. Our overall goal should be to take action to show how this can be done. If gender activists do not embrace those faith-based actors and organizations which want to fulfill SDG 5, I fear we will not achieve SDG 5. For our part, Denmark has taken the lead in the newly established International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance to lead a working group on phobe and gender to prepare new actions towards and at the next ministerial meeting in Brazil at the end of this year. The basis for our work will be the recommendations made by the UN Special Rapporteur on phobe and the recommendations from last year made by the Danish Institute of Human Rights, Marie Juul Petersen, in cooperation with the Stefanus Alliance based on a one-year international expert consultation. Quite a number of you present today were involved in this global expert consultation. You helped us to point to ways in which such positive synergies could be achieved when addressing SDGs on health, education, climate change, and access to justice. Essentially, we will discuss your recommendation in the Alliance and prepare for parliamentarians, CSOs, to discuss further actions when they all meet physically or virtually in Brazil at the end of the year. Today, the panelists will address some of these issues in various ways, and I do hope participants will join in with questions and comments. As you see from the program, you'll hear extraordinary and distinguished personalities speaking today. But before the roundtable, first let me give the floor to our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Musimbi Kanyoro. Dr. Kanyoro is an accomplished leader with extensive experience in women's movements and organizations, international NGOs, and is the immediate past president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. She has also served on the advisory role on gender issues with the World Bank, UN Women, and various other organizations and initiatives. Kanyoro is a published author and editor of books, articles, and inspirational speeches, and has received numerous awards and recognitions internationally. Dr. Kanyoro, it is a great honor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much, compatriot panelists, our chair, and the organizers of this forum. I am in a very comfortable position in that I am in a forum which brings faith to the discussion of gender, and I am one of the 84% of people of faith that we talked about that was introduced by our chair today. The women's movement, the activist women's movement, the women's movement seeking rights for women have really been what has formed me over the years. And throughout my professional work, I have worked in ecumenical movements, had the largest interaction with the United Nations, and currently I have also the possibility and privilege of working with business companies in regards to gender justice through the UN Global Compact, and specifically Together Gender Equality Initiative. Why is this important? This is important because just of the way that our panel was framed for today, because it's a panel that is enabling a conversation that can go on, that brings together our governments, very important, businesses, movements, social movements, and religious players together to one table. So I thought that the best that I could do as an introduction, especially when we have such outstanding panelists, was to introduce process-wise. The title for this panel, In Search of a Round Table, is the title of a book that I am an editor of, In Search of a Round Table. The book was published immediately after the Beijing conference in 1995. And the contents of that book was a reflection of what we had heard in Beijing and what we wanted to do henceforth going to the world. The image of a round table is the significance that I think still stays true then as it is today as it was then. It came from a poem by Chuck Latham, who is an American poet. And basically, this image portrays that if we have to go forth with discussing gender issues in the future, we needed to have a space that is a welcoming space. The round table for us was that welcoming space, because in a round table, nobody sits at the head. Everybody is sitting on a same kind of circumference. At a round table, the possibility to hear each other is much higher than in a corner table where the distance between people is much larger. In a round table, you have the possibility to always move back and welcome new players, welcome new people to the table, welcome new people to eat at the table and to contribute something at the table. And at a round table, when you compose that round table well, everybody's voice can be heard. Everybody's voice can be heard. Why was this image then important, and why do I think it's still relevant today? One of the most important conversations that women have brought to the table over time is the fact that we would want the women to be at the tables of decision-making, but not to be at the table simply by being part of the table presence, but really making a difference. That struggle still stays with us, because when we look at the tables of decision-making, we still see that even though we have achieved certain presence, we still see that there's still a long way to go. Whether we are talking about religious institutions, whether we are talking about the multilateral organizations or businesses. So the knock to be part of the round table still remains as valid in 1995 as it is today, that we want more diverse types of women. Part of what we talked about right from Beijing, that it was not enough to open the round table to women as a class, because women are many. They come in many forms. They come as indigenous women. They come as Black women. They come as tall women and short women. And you can give it a description. Women with different political leanings, etc. Women with religious leanings and non-religious meaning. And part of the round table, what we wanted to achieve with that image was the inclusivity that must come with welcoming women at the table. It has to be wide enough to include all the kind of the diversities and accept that those voices are as valid. So one of the marginalizations that we continue to see is when women are welcome to the table and expected to have one opinion, one way of thinking, etc. That makes the round table only a poorer round table. The other important thing that we raised at that time, which we raised today, is that when you have new people joining the table conversation has to change. You cannot continue with the table conversation in the same way. If it's a meal, the menu needs to change. You can't keep on that table eating the menu of the host of the table or the person who initiated the table forever and a day. We wanted to be sure that when women join the tables of decision-making at every level, that the conversation at that table will not only widen, but become even much more relevant. A couple of days ago, we heard from Vice President of the USA, Kamala Harris, speaking about democracy needs to be part of the gender discussion. And it was very interesting to me because we talked at that time theologically also about democracy, led by none other but Professor Elizabeth Fiorenza, who is a teacher at Harvard. And she reflected in a very big article about equality, gender equality, and equality within ecclesia. Ecclesia is within the church. That's the background from which she was speaking about. And she talked about democracy. But I think the democracy here that she talked about was a democracy, I want to rephrase this to say, a democracy is one that values or puts a lot of validity on the new voices that have come on the table. So when we look at democracy now or in the future, we must think of a democracy of the future is one that accepts and nurtures what women have brought at the table. It's not one that continues to go on with an agenda that has not included subjects such as eradicating violence against women, subjects such as ensuring that schools are inclusive of matters that are important to the children, because these are areas where women have really brought a big agenda on social issues that impact on the lives of the people. Of course, as Ambassador says, change takes a long, long time to be implemented. But women often also say, justice delayed is justice denied. There are just certain things that can't wait. Yes, we agree that it takes a long time for everybody to come on board. But when we are at the United Nations and in other spaces within the religious institutions, many of which are hosting this, etc., we know that certain things can be done yesterday, not just today, but yesterday, because there are a lot of people who are convinced that it's the right thing to do. Then finally, I want to talk about some of the things that we talked about that were important that time. We talked about power. If you read many publications and hear many presentations that are made, there are people who say women are afraid to take power in their hands. Women do not want to discuss power. All that is the talk of a long time ago, because in 1995, as we discussed power, and as I continue to interact with women in many forums, women talk about power. Women are ready to handle power. Like men, women experience power in different ways because power does not exist in a vacuum. But what we have talked over since then and time and again is that we have to understand in what context we talk about power. When we see power as commodity, that's a language that I can use now as I work with businesses a lot, then it's quite easy to see that it's so little of it that we have to fight for it, and we have to commodify what we want the power to be used about. When we see power as the capacity to enable us to do things that are important, I think we can see the potential of what women are already doing and what women will do more of when their power is recognized. But most important, I think what we found that time and what I continue to see discussed and realized and affirmed in many spaces is that women bring to the table the power of relationships, the power of not just doing or being things, but relating to people, to other people, relating to our environment, understanding the relationship between what we do today and what our world could become tomorrow, impacted by the climate change. These are issues of today. These are issues that impact everybody's life, whether they are rooted inside an institution or not. And I think that women say, we want our voices to be present in these particular issues. And we want to be able to work, women and men together, religious and groups and secular groups together, to affirm that this is a reality. We want to be able to work with businesses, because our world is made up of all of these businesses as well. There was a time when there was a big distance between what civil society did and what businesses do. And today we see that there are people who are employed in every sector. When we look at the impact of COVID, we can see what women have been contributing in these areas and how the marginalization continues and even shows itself much more during this pandemic. And so our voice continues to be there, that we continue to search for a round table where what has happened to women, what has happened to women, as so many women leave the workplace now because of the pandemic, that the world that is listening at the United Nations and elsewhere will be able to bring to the table the actual gender differences that make our society not to be an equal society. So this is what we thought in 1995, and this is what continues to be even much more relevant today. And I believe that the panelists will take this to the next stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nora. I am so touched by this compelling and poetic imagery of the ever expanding, boundless, round table made up of this exquisite garden of women, like garden of flowers, every size, every shape, every color, every walk of life, and not just the tolerance or even acceptance of that, but actually the very specific desirability of that we are very specifically desiring the variety of the women around the table, the way that any garden is going to actively desire the variety of different flowers in a garden, and the crucialness of that, the really essential nature of that. And what I also really loved about that image is when we think of a table, most of us think of food. We're feeding each other. We are serving each other. And at a table, any of our tables, any of our families across the world, there are some universal rules, like no one takes the whole bowl of potatoes and scoops it all onto their plate. We share. We all share and we pass. We share, we pass. And that image of coming together, feeding each other, serving each other as this essential and exquisite variety of women is such a beautiful, beautiful image. And of course, not exclusively women, but just ensuring that we have that variety of women at the table and being able to just keep expanding. You know, here in India, there's sort of a general rule that there's no Hindi translation for there's no more room. There's always more room. There's always room for another person at the table. And I think that this is such a critical element when we're talking about not only gender equality, but all of these sustainable development goals and all of that work of development in our world. And just lastly, I wanted to mention this teaching that so many of our traditions have in different languages in different ways about a family that eats together, stays together. There was billions of dollars of research done in America many years ago about family values and how families that eat together at least one meal a day stay together. So again, that image of all of us at one table, eating, feeding, serving is a very compelling and very poetic and very beautiful image. So thank you so much for really illuminating that. And just very quickly also, great gratitude to Ambassador Soor for highlighting the importance of strategic partnerships and how important it is for all of us to really join hands and hearts with each other across all of the borders and boundaries, and especially coming together with the world of faith. And deep gratitude to Denmark for leading the way of that in such a powerful way, and for you for your role in helping Denmark to lead that. We now shift into the panel discussion. And the way that the panel discussion is going to work is we have very eminent panelists in a variety of different areas of expertise. Each of them will have 2 questions. So for the first question, they will also respond to what they have heard up to that moment. So each question is allocated about 4 minutes. But the first question will be an extra few minutes to also respond to all of that which they have heard first. And our first panelist is Reverend Luz Marina Campos Garcia, a Lutheran pastor and researcher in law at the postgraduate program of the National Faculty of Law at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. A defender of human rights with an emphasis on gender. She spoke at the Federal Supreme Court public hearing in the context of argution of non-compliance with fundamental precept number 442 in defense of decriminalization of abortion in Brazil. She is a pastor for ACT Alliance. And the first question to Reverend Luz Marina Campos Garcia is, you are a human rights defender and a pastor. Why do you think that working with faith is so important if we are going to achieve gender equality by 2030?
So it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's an honor. And I'd like to say that working with faith is essential for 2 reasons I would like to highlight. First, because the main arguments used to suppress women's autonomy, dignity, rights are religious. Second, because religious narratives have the power to set people free. The Christian tradition, marked predominantly by a patriarchal theology, has been deconstructed in a more organized way in the last 6 to 7 decades by the work of women committed to methods of feminist theology, and more recently in the concept and language of gender justice. This gigantic work was fully adopted by part of the Christian churches. At least in Latin America, few churches have given space for feminist theology discourse and gender debate. However, the space it has conquered was enough to use a violent reaction with extreme aspects that we are experiencing today. In our countries, women are being threatened, persecuted, raped, and murdered under the protection of religious discourse. So producing and supplying alternative religious hermeneutics for women has become an emergency task. We realize that feminist or gender-based religious hermeneutics are indispensable not only for women of faith, but for the entire feminist movement, since the setbacks we are experiencing nowadays are not limited to the field of women's sexual and reproductive rights, but to the rights of being considered a fully human being. The ongoing process of dehumanizing women in such a context, biblical and theological arguments that affirm the dignity and autonomy of women become fundamental. When I spoke at the Federal Supreme Court in Brazil in favor of decriminalizing abortion in 2018, I presented biblical and theological arguments. The words had such an impact on Brazilian society that non-believers, non-religious women and men compared them to a lightning streaking across the sky, breaking the darkness. The imagery was of this bright light illuminating the shadows. Similar experience had Maria de Los Angeles, for instance, and Mercedes who spoke at the Congress in Argentina, and other feminist theologians who have been invited to present gender-based religious arguments in the public sphere. So in Latin America, feminist religious discourse seems more than ever to be fundamental in the public debate on women's rights and gender equality. The conclusion is that there is no way to achieve gender equality in 2030 without incorporating feminist religious discourse into the agenda of social movements, human rights, and women's rights organizations, faith-based organizations, and state educational policies. So we are, as Dr. Musimbi Cañoro said before, are at this moment to talk again and think again about methodologies and agendas and discussion that we had in 1995, 1997, recognizing that what we are living today, I think it is a response from the patriarchal society that cannot accept how women have become autonomous, how women have taken power seriously in order to change those, how women sat at the round table and made a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very cogent and also very compelling answer, not just for the importance of engaging with faith, but the importance also of new narratives and new voices of faith at that table. And the second question is that some argue that governments are instrumentalizing religion and religious actors. So how can multi-stakeholder actors promote more transformative partnerships that embody real consultation and shared agendas?
Well, you know, I am speaking from a place of emergency and urgency in Brazil. As you all know, most of Latin American countries were able to implement social democracies throughout 2000 and 2010 decades. One by one of those governments were taken down through several types of coup d'etat. Some countries managed to restore democracy through social-oriented government, and some are still struggling, like Brazil. In all cases, religious leaders were instrumental in the process of dismantling social democracies. In the case of Brazil, they remain being one of the pillars sustaining the present government. They are the ones voting hate speech, fake news, anti-gender agenda, militarization of government, selling guns to the population, anti-WHO guidance in the context of coronavirus pandemic. Yesterday, we reached 2,798 deaths in 24 hours, and it is increasing. For 18 consecutive days, the country has recorded records of moving average death, which now surpasses the USA. Bolsonaro is against lockdown, against using masks, hid the purchase of vaccines, tried to prevent a national vaccination plan. What we are doing in Brazil to face the pandemic is being done against the will and policies of the President of the Republic. Sanitary doctors, epidemiologists, researchers are pointing to millions of new coronavirus strains being produced in Brazil. They start speaking of SARS-CoV-3, which will be generated here. So it's already today a global threat. And what part of religious leaders do? Mostly Christian leaders. They keep supporting the president. They justify the death of the population with religious arguments. So this discourse is only being instrumentalized to disable gender. It has been instrumentalized to justify what in Brazil we are starting to call the use of the state, the use of public policies to not prevent contamination, to hinder the population access to vaccination, and thus causing the population's death. Deaths that could be avoided. On January 20, 380 evangelical and Catholic leaders filed impeachment requests against President Jair Bolsonaro in the National Congress. The following day, the Minister of Women, Family, and Human Rights, who you know is a pastor, published an ordinance opening a register for church organizations in order to receive funds from the federal government. Immediately, the nationalship of most of the evangelical churches published notes saying that the request for impeachment was not a decision of the institutional churches. So, yes, religious discourse has been service of the present government of Brazil. But of course, there is resistance. And one way of resisting is working together, is sharing agendas, is financing people who are resisting, you know, most women and men, theologians and pastors in Latin America are employed. We have learned that several organizations or Christian-related organizations from the US has sent over the last decade 1 billion to promote anti-gender agenda through the national Congress in different countries in Latin America, through the judicial system in different countries of Latin America, and Brazil is quite a good example of that. So yes, we have to band together in a state of emergency, as we are now, in a polarized and fragmented time like we are living, doing the work in networks and together, joining ecumenical and initiatives like this one here is an act of resistance. So togetherness must guide us. because we are stronger and we break isolation and fragmentation this way. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Reverend Luz Marina Campos Garcia for the very inspiring, very deep, and very compelling remarks, and also for the great work that you are doing there in Brazil with ACT Alliance to really bring about health, healing, clarity, and collaboration for gender equality and so much more for the health of the people there. We move on now to our next panelist, Shaheen Ashraf. And Shaheen Ashraf is the head of the Global Advocacy for Islamic Relief Worldwide. She leads the organization's pioneering work on faith, gender, research, thought leadership, and advocacy. She is a senior leader in her field and has over 25 years' experience in addressing issues of injustice and inequality from an intersectional perspective. Prior to this, Shaheen worked at a senior level in a number of global humanitarian, women's rights, and civil society organizations. Her recently published work highlights the convergence of gender development and Islam. Shaheen is the current co-chair of our PARD Gender Working Group. So Shaheen, it's wonderful to have you with us. And we'll start with your first question, which is that, as mentioned in your bio, you are the co-lead of the gender work stream for PARD. And here we are meeting during CSW 65, which focuses specifically on leadership and women in decision-making spaces. What do you think are the critical elements required to achieve and maintain greater diversity at decision-making tables?
Thank you to Reverend Musimbi, Dr. Musimbi, and Reverend Lucy Manara. I think some really important points have come out of their discussion, specifically around human rights defenders and working with faith communities. I think the one thing that I got from that was about the religious narratives to kind of speak about setting women free. And it's important because when we talk about freedom, I mean, whose freedom are we talking about and who is at the table to ensure that kind of freedom? So for the past few years, and more organizational leaders we're seeing, and more governments and more spaces have been increasingly thoughtful in terms of getting the right combination of people. And this includes racial and gender diversity at the table, because just having diversity in terms of gender is one thing, but to have the racial narrative of that gender diversity at the table is the best decision that we can make. Yet what I find is, in times of crisis, in times of calamity, in times of disaster or catastrophe, when the stakes are at their highest and strategic decision-making is of paramount importance, I find that when we come to those spaces, it just takes people a few more seconds, and it will take people a few more extra minutes needed to ensure that there are a diverse group of voices that will be engaged in problem-solving discussions. Out of this, what we find is that the pressure to make decisions quickly were given to leaders and they form their original habits and biases by nabbing the people that they're most comfortable with when it takes part in these kind of critical conversations. And I can talk that from a UK government perspective. I can talk about it from other perspectives of other governments as well. I found over the years that the benefits of gender diversity can be categorized into 5 themes. And it's really important to understand that when you look at the categorization, people look at improved financial performance, people look at strengthening organizational climate, for example, or organizational culture, increased corporate social responsibility and reputation, leverage talent and enhanced innovation and collective intelligence. Overall, what you find is experts agree that prioritizing diversity and inclusion has become an imperative. And it's a bit about what Reverend Lucy Manara had said earlier on, because actually who is invited to the table? This is very important. And then also, what is it that is prioritized when it comes to that table? And the measure that I see is that of any great leadership, sadly, is that this is often tested in a crisis, yet having that few extra minutes to ensure that the right people remain at the table is imperative to maximize the likelihood of success for any organization or group. I sit on the Partnership for Religion and Development. I'm one of the co-chairs alongside my co-chair, Marie-Christine, as well as Rachel. And what we find is that when we're part of the discussions around measuring leadership, it has to be of the greatest imperative that people who are diverse have to be at that table, whether that's a business, whether that's a government, whether that's a nonprofit or a community organization. And sometimes I see within my experience the difference between good decisions and great decisions and even exceptional decisions can change or save lives when we have women at the table, and particularly those of women of color as well. So there's certainly been the case in 2020. What we've noticed, inclusive teams make better business decisions up to 87% of the time. Teams that follow an inclusive process make decisions 2 times faster with half their team meetings. Decisions made and executed by diverse teams delivered 60% better results. And I have to say this, diversity and inclusion must go hand in hand to drive results. And from my experience where I'm sitting, we still have a very, very long way to go get those diverse voices around the table. Despite the increasing efforts to boost women's representation in decision-making in the last decades, women still remain underrepresented in positions of power. Back to you, Sadvi.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much also for sticking to the second to time. We are running short of time, and it's always such a challenge in these events with so much to say and so much to share, and yet such a shortage of time. So thank you so much for being so powerful and also so succinct. The second question is, why is enabling diverse leadership critical for achieving Sustainable Development Goal 5? And of course, all the SDGs. As we know, they're all interwoven and interlinked. So why is this diverse leadership so critical?
So Sadvi, in answering your question, if we want to see the interconnectedness of, for example, SDG 16 on just peaceful and inclusive societies with other 2030 agenda goals and targets, we have to recognize that all the goals are of great importance. The people that are most likely to be left behind in development are those who endure discrimination and inclusion on the grounds of identity. Often those are multiple identities. And it was in a special report by a UN Special Rapporteur just recently who highlighted that actually discrimination and inclusion on those grounds will most likely people will be left behind as a result of that. So there's 3 points that I want to bring on here. Is one will be on race. For anything to happen and anything to be inclusive, race and faith have to have diverse leadership. For me, without a doubt, are the main pain points in the transatlantic intersectionality debates. I believe that if race is no longer the central axis of intersectional analysis, intersectionality would lose its critical edge. And we will once again fall between the cracks. And if women of color and women who are not part of the debate are not the producers and users of intersectional theory, their knowledge production will continue to be silenced and devalued. The second thing is on female leadership. Female leadership as an intersectional approach is of great importance. And for me, I think this is one of the critical things to driving the SDGs forward. So a better, more diverse leadership coincides with a better world, which inherently coincides with the critical inflection point on gender equality. In our societies, the discussion around women's rights and equality have intensified in many parts of the world due to the movements initiated by women themselves who found voice, and by the men who support them. And when I'll say some men, not all men. And so the UN's Global Goals for Sustainable Development, which were agreed by 193 countries, and their 17 objectives to eliminate poverty, to improve education, health outcomes, better jobs, and tackle key environmental challenges by 2030, if we don't have those intertwined, we are at the risk of losing and staying and allowing and also co-creating what we see is leaving people behind. But my biggest focus is on Global Goal 5, sadly, which means actually in Global Goal 5, what we see is sometimes women are cast as beneficiaries of those goals. And in order for us to show that not only do women serve to gain from fulfillment of the goals, they're also helping to lead the achievement. We need women everywhere to encourage them to step forward and lead through the global goals wherever and whatever their spheres of influence. And I think these movements are not just about how gender equality benefits women as individuals. They're also concerned with how all of society benefits when women and people of color have equal representation at that table of power within their communities, as well as within business, as well as within government, to lead and strive the world that we choose to do. It may be, sadly, that there is an unintended consequence, but this limited discourse risks positioning women as beneficiaries of the goal, and we do not want to see this, because what we want is to see that individuals whose leadership is required to achieve them are the biggest part of moving this agenda forward. The intention is to bridge a gap in our conversation today, and it's about finding and showing that when more women are in corporate or decision-making positions, their companies benefit, as do society and the environment. And my third point and my final point in pursuing the goals, I inherently believe that they are important drivers of positive change, the global goals. And to achieve the goals by 2020, we need all leaders, private, public, voluntary, from senior executives, from governments, FBOs, faith-based organizations, academia. And the one big thing we do need is including investors to value and embed the leadership skills that would unlock these sustainable opportunities at speed and at scale. We can't sit back and wait for the world that we want to see, one that is fairer, inclusive, and sustainable, unless we understand that the responsibility rests on the shoulders of everyone who has the opportunity to influence the world's trajectory. Women's voices must be heard, and we need men to champion gender equality in leadership too, challenge the status quo to ensure that more women can lead in order to meet the 2030 deadline. Back to you, Sadhvi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. It's such a critical point. I mean, you've made so many critical points, but just very quickly to highlight one of them, that this is not about women as beneficiaries. This is about our nations and our world as a beneficiary. And that when any group, here we're speaking about women, but of course, when it's also a color, a race, a religion, are left out, the whole boat sinks, as in that story of the hole in the boat. The whole thing sinks if there's a hole in any part of the boat. And we're all in this boat together. So gender equality, empowerment, and women's rights make for stronger women, stronger families, stronger societies, stronger communities, stronger nations, and a stronger world. So thank you so much. And we turn now to Ryan Toby Coloti of the United Society Partners in the Gospel. Ryan Toby Coloti is a first-year master's student at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. Ryan's research interests are in the field of feminist theology, and his thesis focuses on pastoral care responses to clergy sexual abuse. Ryan is a member of the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice, and currently serves as the center's research assistant and tutors religion and social justice. Ryan, you are currently studying feminist theology. In some spaces, feminine and religion are seen as opposing forces. Where do you see the intersections between feminism and faith-based approaches?
Thank you very much, and gratitude to all those that have spoken before me. Permit me to, first of all, position myself within this conversation. I'm a male lay minister in the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. I hold privilege because of my biological sex, socially assigned gender, and the position of authority which I occupy within the church. And within the hierarchy of the church, the position of a lay minister is the most senior liturgical position by a non-ordained layperson. Therefore, while I consider myself as an activist, I acknowledge that my position may also advance institutional religion and liturgy that entrenches patriarchy and the oppression of women. I am therefore complicit in symbolic and liturgical violence against women and a product of a patriarchal society that promotes male privilege. Therefore, at no point am I speaking on behalf of women's experiences, but those of my own. Now, going back to your question regarding feminist theory and religion, and the subsequent question on the interconnections between feminism and faith-based approaches. Well, let me respond to this from an African perspective. The Mountain Kingdom of Lesotho, to be specific. As an African man, I know at the first hand how myths and religious discourses have been created and sustained in opposition to feminism, in service to patriarchy, to create this dichotomy between feminist principles and faith-based principles. So, for example, the religious discourse that argues that the man is the head of the house, as commanded by God in the holy sacred texts, or the false idea that Muslim women wearing hijabs for religious reasons cannot be feminist at the same time. Now, from a scholarship point of view, various feminist and queer scholars have made significant contributions in nuancing discourses which perpetuate ideas of Africa as an inherently patriarchal and homophobic continent. Yet in both cases, we seem to see an increase in how feminist research continues to disrupt these myths by contextualizing the very same discourses within the multiple national and localized political economies and faith landscapes in the different parts of Africa. I therefore believe that a more nuanced analysis is needed of the politics of different faith traditions, which also account for the subversive and transformative discourses and acts that are produced by those whom the research engages. Now, coming for the second part of your question regarding the interconnectionist between feminism and faith-based approaches. Feminist theology and faith-based approaches have one fundamental interconnection. They take religion very seriously, but more than that, their starting point is the lived religious experiences of women. If we take, for example, African feminist theologian Musa Dube's question of, but who do you say I am? When Jesus, of course, asked this to Simon Peter in the New Testament. Putting that in the background, we all know that gender is a social construction of men and women, distributes power unequally amongst boys and girls, amongst men and women, amongst clergy and the laity, wives and husbands, globally. Social locations such as the family, the school, the church, and the village reinscribes gender roles to the disadvantage of women, and this is simply because people do not take women's lived religious experiences seriously. In all of these, more often than not, gender locates women as without a voice, without property, without independent identity or power to make and implement their own decisions in society. Therefore, a feminist-based approach, a feminist faith-based approach will take seriously those serious social locations. Therefore, failure to take seriously the lived experiences of women leads to women internalizing their own marginalization as normal. This leaves many women yet to answer the question by Musa Dube and Jesus to Simon Peter asking, but who do you say that I am, for themselves? Back to you, moderator.
Thank you, Ryan. And the follow-up question is that your studies focus on clergy sexual abuse. How can the misuse of power within religious leadership be effectively challenged and the root causes addressed and therefore obviously eradicated?
Thank you very much. I think let me at first state that I do have a theoretical, critical view on using the phrase root causes. Apart from its essentialist nature, I think it ignores the pervasive nature of clergy sexual abuse in comparison to other different forms of gender-based violence. Though I'm tempted to say that perhaps patriarchy is the root cause of it all, but because I want to acknowledge the varied contexts, I'll simply mention a few ways through which the misuse and the abuse of power by religious leaders can be challenged. And I mentioned two things, positionality and privilege. Now, on the issue of positionality, I want to say that religious leaders need to challenge their own position and acknowledge the role it plays in perpetuating sexual abuse. Unfortunately, there's nothing anyone can do until religious leaders themselves acknowledge the power that comes with their roles. What does it mean to be a religious leader, for example? Any priest that acknowledges the clerical and clericalism power that he or she has will never initiate any sexual relationship with any congregant, even when the congregant appears to have consented or initiated the sexual relation. It can never be described as an affair. It is simply abuse. You see, the role of religious leaders carries with it authority and power and the attendant responsibility to use that very same power to benefit the people who call on religious leaders for service. This power can be easily misused, as is the case when a member of the clergy uses intentionally or unintentionally his or her authority to initiate or pursue a sexual relationship with a congregant. Even if the congregant who sexualizes the relationship is still the religious leader's responsibility to maintain the boundaries of the pastoral relationship and not pursue any sexual relationship. On the second point of privilege, on the privilege issue, it's more about the real men issue and the masculinity. Here, I think masculinities needs to be deconstructed and recalibrated. So slogans which are often posted on social media and used by religious leaders, such as "real men do not drape," "not on my watch," "we need to protect our women," all those slogans, intentionally or unintentionally, they represent much of the noise around condoning clergy sexual abuse and the oppression of non-gender conforming people. And these are often framed around the notions of what is a real man. Now, the problem with this framing for me is that religious leaders use the very simple trick language that makes gender-based violence possible as a way to undo it. Hence, we get shocked when someone reports a sexual abuse by a priest, for example. And I think up until we can then interrogate those two things of the position of a priest, putting in mind clericalism, and the privilege of a religious leader within a space of faith. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and for this clarity. And also thank you so much for, as a man, and as a man in your position, for making this your focus and your subject, and for being a model for other men of how to stand up and really commit yourself for gender equality, empowerment, and safety and security for women in all spaces, but especially the space of religion. So thank you very much for being with us today. And we turn now to our next panelist, Dr. Nora Khalaf Ellich of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. She's a consultant. She's a freelance gender and development practitioner and a postdoctoral fellow at the Faith and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London. She holds a doctoral degree in gender, religion, and development as well from the University of London. And our questions for Dr. Nora, what I'm going to be doing now, since time is short, instead of asking first one question, then the response, then a second question, is I'm going to ask you both of the questions together and request you to give your answer in a way that weaves the responses to both topics together into one cohesive whole. So the two questions for you are, this year, the global community marks the 26th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women and the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action of 1995. Why do you think member states, this many years later, are still struggling to achieve the commitments they made 26 years ago? And the second question is, what needs to happen? So the reason for the problem, and then what is the solution? What needs to happen for religions and faith actors to be recognized as critical change makers in accelerating action toward gender justice? So, Dr. Nora, if you could respond to these multifaceted multifaceted points in the two questions all together in one, that would be fantastic.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a real pleasure to join this important discussion. I want to say thank you to the previous panelist, Rainy, for his thoughts on the links between feminism and religion. I think it's so important to continuously challenge the perception that these two categories don't go together, because assuming that those two things are mutually exclusive really silences the voices of women and of feminists and religious communities. And at the same time, it emboldens and legitimizes patriarchal religious interpretations. So I really, really appreciate your contribution here. So let me move on to your first question. This is a very important question, but it's a big question, because setbacks to gender equality intersect with setbacks in so many other areas, such as education, property rights, climate change, racial equality, and so on. But let me highlight 3 reasons that come to mind. The first one is, of course, the fragility of any achievements in terms of gender equality and women's rights. So this means that gender equality is not a one and done task, but something that needs continuous work. We can see this most clearly in the extreme case scenarios, such as conflicts, famines, or like right now in the case of a global pandemic. So whenever society as a whole experiences a setback, be it politically, economically, environmentally, women tend to be hit hardest, and they pick up the majority of any surplus labor. So within days, years of gender progress can be undone. The other issue is that the subject of gender itself continues to be sidelined by member states and development organizations. There are still too many people that either don't really understand what gender means, what it has to do with them, or why it matters. So on paper, gender equality and women's rights are a priority issue, but in reality, gender is more often a simple box that needs to be checked to move forward and to secure funding. So right now, you have a situation where in many development organizations, the task to mainstream gender and the task to advocate for the Beijing commitments is resting on just a handful of people. And these practitioners struggle to get their colleagues' attention. So right now, too much time is still being wasted on trying to convince people about the importance of gender goals. And this is really obstructing getting to the real work. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement here. A wider and more solid gender education is needed. And a good start might be clarifying some of the common misconceptions, like that all women experience gender inequality in the same way, which of course is not true. Many laws will only affect poorer women, or women of color, or LGBT people. Another common misconception is that all women will always act in the interest of other women. Of course, women can be and are patriarchal too. Lastly, I think that it's important to acknowledge that most member states today, both in the global north and also in the global south alike, still continue to be very patriarchal. Sometimes patriarchy is very visible. You know, for example, when gender-based violence is protected by law, or when women are not trusted to make decisions over their own bodies, or when women are paid less for the same work as their male colleagues. But then there are a lot more subtle manifestations of patriarchy. For example, when women's title changed from Miss to Mrs. after marriage, but men stayed the same. Or when a midwife is tipped double after a boy is delivered. And all these examples are ways in which patriarchy is upheld on a daily basis, meaning a system is kept in place that privileges men over women. But if we are serious about the Beijing Declaration, we have to acknowledge all forms of patriarchy, visible and invisible. And we have to take a very, very self-critical look in the mirror. Your second question asked what needs to happen for religious actors to be recognized as critical change makers in accelerating action towards gender justice. And I think a lot of good progress has happened here already, but definitely a lot more can be done. I'll highlight two areas briefly. The first one goes hand in hand with what I just said about an improved understanding of gender. So if we as development practitioners invest more time and more attention into our gender analysis, then religion would naturally emerge as a key dimension. If you truly study gender and religion in any given area, you would realize that these two categories are so deeply entangled, you cannot have one without the other. And we need to empower our gender practitioners to be able to conduct such deep quality studies. And we need to ensure that later there is commitment and interest to implement these results. Because right now there are many religious voices and initiatives that have long engaged with gender equality. And it's really a matter of supporting these efforts and making them visible. The second thing that needs to happen is a change in the way that the traditionally secular development industry looks at religion and religious actors. At the moment, the term secularism is consciously or unconsciously attached to a whole lot of positive attributes like neutrality, impartiality, efficiency, you name it. Meanwhile, religion is still often associated with subjectivity, gender inequality, or violence. And this opposition, of course, is unconstructive and it's untrue. Of course, partners in development should be vetted based on their track record and commitments to gender equality, but these standards should be the case for everyone, religious or secular. Overcoming assumptions and suspicions surrounding religion and religious actors will require a lot of work and dedication. This is a very, very touchy topic, and nobody really wants to talk about this right now because it gets very personal. But all people do continue to have biases and prejudices, and it's important to acknowledge these because they impact the way that religious actors are included or excluded in gender equality efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora, for a beautiful and very, very cohesive talk on the multifaceted aspects that I had asked you in such a short time. Thanks so much for touching upon all of the different aspects in such a very, very clear way. We move now to our final panelist, Dr. Soumya Uma, Associate Professor of the Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University, based in India. She is the associate professor with over 27 years of combined work experience as an academic, a law researcher, a lawyer, a trainer, a writer, and a campaigner on gender law and human rights. And for Dr. Soumya Uma, the two questions that she'll be responding to are, first of all, you recently contributed to an expert consultation process that involved a diverse range of secular as well as faith-based experts from different institutional, professional, religious, and geographic backgrounds, and with expertise in different areas. The findings are summarized in the research report on freedom of religion and belief, gender equality, and the SDGs. Could you share with us here today some of the key findings of that? And the second question is, what are the challenges that you feel still remain to be addressed, either in policy, practice, or research? So turning over to Dr. Somya Uma.
Thank you, Sadhvi, and thank you to the organizers and for having me here. And being the last panelist, it has its advantages as well as disadvantages, I think. The advantage, in a sense, is that, you know, all the panelists with you know, the viewpoints that they have expressed have really invigorated my own thought process. And I'm going to take a minute to highlight some of the things that resonate with me and how I associate my ideas with them before I respond to the two questions which Sadhvi has asked me. Starting with Dr. Musimbi, who in her talk talked about you know, bringing women to the round table, but bringing them not in a nominal way, but in a substantial way. So very often we see this kind of a tokenism where you have a room full of men and you bring in one woman just to show a kind of inclusion. But I think the very powerful point that she made really resonates with me in terms of decision making, that we are talking about having equal status, equal power in terms of participation as well as in decision making. And that becomes very important even when we are talking about gender equality and within the religious sphere. Moving on to Reverend Luz Marina, one of the takeaways for me from her talk was about the need for feminist interpretation of religious texts. And I think that's really, really important because many of the texts have been interpreted in a patriarchal manner. They've been interpreted in a manner that that advances the vested interests of the people who were interpreting. And so I think feminist interpretations or feminist reinterpretations of religious texts becomes vital. But my anxiety is that that should not just remain as an alternative interpretation, but how do we also ensure that that alternative interpretation of religious texts becomes a mainstream interpretation? So that's just something that I thought you know is something that I'm thinking about loudly. Then the third speaker, who was Shaheen, Dr. Shaheen Ashraf, she emphasized on diverse and inclusive religious leadership, and that really resonates with me. And here we are talking a lot about you know, gender and religion and the intersectionality between those. But in the South Asian context, for example, where I come from, it is not only you know, gender and religion as two important identities, but also caste becomes an important identity or marker, and the intersection of all these three also become very important when we talk about gender equality and freedom of religion. Moving on to Mr. Kaloti, I thought that his point about more nuanced discourse being required is a very, very important point, and that really resonates with me in terms of the interpretations of religious beliefs and practices, and how do we rationalize some of these? And can we do that in a nuanced manner that neither compromises on feminist principles, nor does it compromise on faith-based approaches? So how do we do that? So that was a point. And Dr. Nora, who spoke just before me, I thought the point that she started with, which was about the fragility of women's rights and the need for continuous work. That is so important because very often, I mean, being a part of the women's movements for over 27 years, I know that many times we ask for a law, we get a law, and we know that we cannot just be happy and think that, okay, we have got an achievement. But what happens then? How do you make sure that we implement it? How do we make sure that there is an awareness? How do we make sure that a particular normative standard then is implemented at the ground level as well? So I think the fragility of women's rights and the need for continuous work that Dr. Nora talked about, I think that is a key to moving forward as well. Now, I'll respond briefly to the first question and maybe a little more elaborately on the second question about challenges. So the first question in terms of the report that came out of this expert consultation process, this report, it clarified, one thing that it did was to clarify the relationship between FOB and which is freedom of religion or belief, and gender equality. And the second thing that it did was to situate this relationship between FOB and gender equality in the context of the SDGs. And particularly, the expert consultation focused on three particular SDGs. One was on access to justice, which is SDG 16. The second was on health, which was SDG 3, and on education, which is SDG 4. Now, I just want to, given the paucity of time, I want to highlight three key findings. The first finding in this report was that there is a broad consensus among the participants in the expert consultation process about the need for continued clarification of what FOB entails and how does it relate to gender equality. So FOB is not about protection of religion, but it is about protecting individuals and groups' rights to have religion, to adopt religion, to change religion, to leave a religion or belief, and to manifest and practice religion, and to be free from discrimination on the grounds of religion. The report did find that there is a contested relationship between FOB and gender equality, but there is no inherent contradiction between the two. And most world religions are open to a multitude of different interpretations. And so religion can be a strong source of motivation and mobilization in struggles for inclusion, equality, and non-discrimination. So that's the first finding. Second finding was the need for more systematic attention to religiously related discrimination and the gender aspects of that in Agenda 2030. Now, Agenda 2030 encourages us to pay attention to discrimination and marginalization, but within that, religion-based discrimination is often overlooked. And if Agenda 2030 is truly to leave no one behind, then there is a need for more systematic attention to religion-based discrimination. The third finding was that engagement with religious actors is indispensable when addressing phobe violations and broader discriminations on the grounds of religion and gender. And this is for two purposes. One is, of course, to challenge discriminatory norms and values around gender and religion or belief. But secondly, it's also to support those actors who are working to promote phobe and gender equality. And many of such religious actors were there at the expert consultation as well. And they have been foregrounding the voices and lived realities of women as well as SOGI communities. And it's important to support and strengthen their efforts. Now, the second question that you asked, Sadhvi, about where are the challenges that remain to be addressed? I think the challenges are many. And your question talked about challenges. You asked about challenges in policy, also challenges at the practice level, and challenges in research. So maybe I'll just highlight one or two in each of these. Challenges in policy, the topmost on my mind right now is about discriminatory family laws. And I think family laws that discriminate against women and SOGI communities are a major area of law and policy that requires reforms, yet it is one of the most challenging. And we know that Article 16 of CEDAW has been one of the most contentious and controversial provisions, with a largest number of declarations and reservations, in fact, only because it talks about bringing about equality within the family structures. So I think that is one aspect. And of course, blasphemy laws, which disproportionately affect religious minority communities and women among them. So we know of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman in Pakistan, and Meliana, a Buddhist woman in Indonesia, are some examples. And the third challenge in terms of law and policy would be informal and customary justice systems, which have their advantages, have their benefits, but they can also be highly patriarchal, and they can downplay gender-based violence or even perpetuate discrimination and violence. In South Asia, for example, we have Khap Panchayats, we have Jirga in Pakistan and Afghanistan, we have Shalish in Bangladesh, and many times these give anti-women decisions, and they wield power through a combination of religious and cultural sources. So those are some major challenges at the law and policy level. At the practice level, I think there is some kind of a mutual suspicion and a lack of trust between phobe actors and feminists or actors working towards gender equality. And I think that is a major challenge, and that is something that needs to be breached, because there are intersecting, intersecting interests, there are intersecting benefits. And so that is something that we need to work on. For many who work on gender equality, religion itself is seen as an obstacle and a barrier, because it is perceived that as institutionalized discrimination. Similarly, for many who work on phobe, they perceive the actors working on gender equality, particularly feminists, to be a threat to the protection of traditions, values, and customary practices. So I think this mutual suspicion is a major challenge that needs to go. And the second challenge at the practical level is also about inclusion of women in religious institutions, on par with men as religious leaders. Some of the speakers before me have spoken about this, and I think this is a very important aspect. Of course, Dr. Nora pointed out that women can be patriarchal too, and I completely agree with her that women can be patriarchal too. So we need religious leaders who are both men and women, not only men. At the same time, whether they are men, women, or they belong to other genders, the whole idea is to have a progressive outlook towards gender equality. And so that becomes crucial. Finally, in terms of challenges in research, I think we still do not have enough research and documented best practices of how religious actors and actors working on gender equality have worked together successfully. I'm sure there are many instances all over the world, but there is a need to have adequate research and a concerted research and documentation of this. We actually need case studies of this kind of success stories so that that will be inspiring for all of us. So with that, I will end the response, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya, for such a comprehensive talk that really packed so much of that research report into such a short time. I know it's a great challenge when you've spent so much time delving into the research and putting it together to try to synthesize that and distill it into just a couple of short minutes. But thank you so much for doing that so beautifully. And I know we're going to be able to make that report available to everyone. It's something that everybody's been asking for, so we'll definitely make sure that the report is available for everyone so that they get all of the full picture as well. And a very deep thank you to all of our panelists for providing such a wealth and a variety of different perspectives, different ideas, different rivers, all of which bring us into that one ocean, the different rivers coming into that one ocean of our collective commitment for gender equality and empowerment, our collective commitment to the SDGs, and our collective awareness of really what is required from each of us on the ground to make that happen. We now have very distinguished speakers giving a response as well as giving concluding remarks. And first, giving a response to all of that which has transpired at this very, very full round table that has continued to expand even during the course of this webinar. We have Zeta Bastos, the Director of Development Partnerships, the Primates World Relief and Development Fund. She has worked as the Development Partnerships Program Director at the Primates World Relief and Development Fund in several different capacities, including as the Africa Program Coordinator and the External Funding Program Manager. She has been awarded the 2020 Karen Takats Award by Cooperation Canada for women's leadership in international development for her invaluable contribution to women's rights and social and economic justice. So we are very glad to have Zeta Bastos here to provide us with a response to all of that which she has heard this evening.
Thank you so very much. And I extend my thanks to the organizers, to the panel presenters, for creating this space for such an important conversation. Dr. Kanyoro, your analogy of a round table being a space where we need to move back and welcome new people to the table is really powerful. And I think that is what we are doing now, or we did through these impressive presentations of panelists. Freedom of religion or belief is a human right. It was outlined in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as a number of international and regional conventions. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action affirmed 12 critical areas where urgent action was needed to ensure greater equality and opportunities for women and girls. While religion was not specifically highlighted, decision-making was, because it intersects with leadership and representation. Women occupy a very important place in participation in religious institutions, but participation does not always translate or reflect representation. And representation matters because it's the first step to full equality. And women's voices need to be represented at venues that affect their lives, including the places where they worship. 84%, it was said by a panelist that 84% of the population identifies with a faith. And a recent Pew Research Center survey estimates that 83.4% of women around the world identify with a faith group, compared to 7.9% of men. This gap means that an estimate 97 million more women than men claim a religious affiliation worldwide. However, women's rights are sometimes violated and undermined on the basis of faith and religion. Faith and religion often serve as the framework to legislate discriminatory laws and enforcement of cultural practices that undermine the rights of women and girls. Gender discrimination and religious dogmas often exist side by side. And one of the big challenges of faith-based religious communities is how to confront and address religious dogmas and structures that intersect and overlap cultural practices that maintain gender-based discrimination and its effects on the lives of women and girls and other minorities. Despite obvious overlaps, actors working for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief and gender equality rarely work together. There is suspicion. In fact, rights relate to freedom of religion or belief and gender equality often seem to be in contradiction with one another. This is because often religion is conservative and patriarchal, therefore an obstacle to achieving gender equality. For instance, the Beirut Declaration on Faith for Rights considers that all believers should join hands and hearts in articulating ways in which faith can stand up for rights more effectively so that both enhance each other. It's a strong recommendation that we should really look at ways of implementing. Freedom of religion or belief can never be used to justify violations of human rights, rights of women and girls and minorities. Female genital mutilation, for instance, forced marriage, child marriages, honor crimes, dowry killings, and other harmful practices are not, under any circumstance, protected by freedom of religion or belief. Just like gender-based violence can never be justified with the reference of freedom of religion or belief. And I really want to, for us to end this roundtable by highlighting that faith-based organizations have historically been key actors in development and humanitarian aid. And we are also actively engaged on SDG number 5. A lot of us are working at community level to ensure gender equality. And it's this synergy that we need to join with faith-based organizations and the civil society to advance the rights of women. We learned a lot in terms of pandemic. We have a history of working in countries affected by the AIDS pandemic. This same synergy, these same lessons should be carried out forward as we try to affect change on those key issues that are gender equality and freedom of belief and religion. And because those rights are interlinked. They are human rights, but by working together, we really complement each other. And I will, for the sake of time, I will end here and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And it was a very beautiful and a very comprehensive response, also a very thought-provoking one, and something that leaves us with so much more additionally to think about. I just wanted to say a very quick note of gratitude to all of our speakers, because each of the speakers has spoken about topics today that are sensitive, that are complicated, that are controversial, and that are very vulnerable. And each of them has been so clear, so compelling, and also so courageous in the topics that they have shared, and in the challenges that they've shared, and the solutions that they've shared. Their voices, their experience, and their expertise are paving the way to a fulfilled SDG 5. But we all must join our hands and our hearts together. Each of us must take a seat at the round table. And even more important than taking our own seat is each of us must pull up a metaphoric chair or 2 or 3 next to us to make sure that those who aren't yet seated at the table get their seat, and get their seat as quickly and inclusively as possible.